Pleasant Golf Club and to the Acre Forum and Anam Cara Awards. This is the 39th annual Irish Cultural Week, and we're so happy after that long 2 years of COVID-19 that we're able to be back celebrating in our normal fashion, and we're very, very grateful that you are all here. First, as everyone knows, Chuck Campbell has been providing us traditional Irish music. Can we have a round of applause for Chuck? We're going to start the evening off with the presentation of the Anam Cara Awards. As many of you know, the Anam Cara Award Ceremony is the committee's annual recognition of individuals who help preserve, promote, and protect the traditions of our Irish heritage, as well as the spirit of giving back that is so prevalent among those who were raised or have a connection to the Acre neighborhood in the city of Lowell, which is where St. Patrick's Parish is. Anam Cara is the Irish Gaelic phrase meaning soul friend, and the Irish Cultural Committee is very blessed to have identified several truly deserving honorees for the awards this year. The first person we would like to honor is Devin Visconti, and before he comes up, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Devin. Devin is not a native Lowellian, so some of you may not know him, but even though you might not know him by name, he's likely very quietly provided services to most of us and our families over the past several years. Devin, since 2019, has really been the backbone of St. Patrick's and St. Mary's cemeteries. He took on the task of ensuring continuing operations through the COVID-19 pandemic. He holds the titles of Operations Manager, Financial Manager, and Staff Accountant. And he is lucky to have a great mentor in his father, who is the Executive Director of the Catholic Cemetery Association for the Archdiocese of Boston. Devin is a graduate of Salem State University. In addition to his work at St. Patrick's and St. Mary's cemeteries, he also owns a private company called Cemetery Needs out of Medford, Massachusetts. And he is here tonight with his lovely fiancee, Jen. So we appreciate you being here. Devin credits his grandfather, who was an avid reader and a storyteller, with inspiring his love for history, which really has made him a great fit at the cemeteries. His paternal grandfather passed down the tradition of being a storyteller and reader and historian to both him and his father. Both him and his father are now preserving history of several Catholic cemeteries in the Archdiocese, and they honor the memories of those laid to rest in those cemeteries. He started off working in the summers, 40 hours a week, at the age of 14, doing groundskeeping work at a cemetery in Salem. And he has described really enjoying what he calls the treasure hunt that ensues. When someone comes to either St. Patrick's or St. Mary's cemeteries with a family name and or a question about their ancestors, and they leave knowing more about their loved ones and their family because of their conversations with Devin and their visits around the cemetery. Devin has recognized, we're grateful for this recognition, that there's been a need for online cemetery records to answer questions for so many people who visit the cemeteries, but their loved ones have passed who may have had the answers. And he has a short-term goal of unearthing those sunken markers that many of us see, particularly at St. Patrick's, to restore, and preserve those records for our future generations. Many people that I've spoken to have talked about, going to visit the cemeteries and noticing that Devin is really the person who is doing the work to try to revive those sunken markers for our ancestors. So we really appreciate that work. As for future goals, Devin has identified that he's looking to map the cemeteries with GPS and link all of the images of the headstones on the website to make searching easier for people looking for relatives and looking to do some ancestry work. He hopes to continue helping people. He hopes to help them feel comforted, and he hopes to help them feel cared for during their time of loss, and he really enjoys honoring the legacy of everyone who's been buried at St. Patrick's and St. Mary's. So we'll enjoy meeting him. I hope you all get to see him, and if you see him on the grounds, make sure to thank him for restoring the monuments and the stones and the stories of all of our loved ones here. So without further ado, I'd ask Devin to come join us. Thanks for being our soul friend. The next two honorees were the last two Anam Cara honorees that our dear friend Garrett Sheehan was able to nominate. Because of the pandemic, our meetings were a little bit sporadic. Sometimes we were meeting by Zoom, and sometimes we were meeting off times. And we were meeting last summer, and he brought up the topic of Anam Cara, an Irish Person of the Year. And it was a little bit early for us to have that discussion. At that time, he was sort of silently battling his illness and didn't really tell us. But sort of a very fun conversation ensued, and everyone was really in agreement. And one of the people who was very special to him was Phil Shea. Phil Shea hails from Lowell's Acre neighborhood, having grown up on Lewis Street in the North Common Village. He's a graduate of Lowell High School and Bentley University. Phil served our region in Lowell in the City Council, the Mass House of Representatives, the State Senate, the Secretary of State's office, the Lowell Regional Transit Authority, and the Lowell Housing Authority. Phil is the only individual to have served on the City Council, Senate, and in the House of Representatives during the almost 8 decades of Lowell's Plan E form of government. The city experienced a great period of revitalization while Phil served in Lowell's public offices. He's well known for providing mentorship opportunities to young persons who have been interested in public service, and has consistently emphasized that the guiding force in his own political life was to never forget from whence he came. Phil has publicly praised the values he learned due to the upbringing in the Acre, and he regularly reminisces about the wonderful life he led and the lessons and experiences he learned in the neighborhood of St. Patrick's Parish. Phil also created a scholarship fund awarding hundreds of thousands of dollars to young residents of the public housing in Lowell who had dreams of achieving higher education. In June of 2021, in the midst of the pandemic, the Lowell community was able to gather and dedicate the Philip L. Shave Bridge over the Western Canal, which is in the vicinity of St. Patrick's Parish. The plaque that dedicated the bridge provides a permanent reminder that Phil Shea had importance to the Acre neighborhood and to the city of Lowell. At the ceremony dedicating the bridge, Phil's friend and his former boss, Secretary of State Bill Galvin, stated, quote, "In many ways, Phil represents the spirit of the city of Lowell. He's a guy that never went down for the count, always comes up all the time, continuing to work for the city of Lowell." When I contacted him about this award, he had to decline the invitation to be here tonight, but he was happy to receive the award. He is unfortunately out of state. He was very honored to receive this award, and most of his emails talked about being from the Acre, so it's very, very apparent that he's very, very proud of his neighborhood, and he has served us so well, so we're very, very appreciative of him. And even though he can't be here, he was honored when the committee suggested that the Sheehan family accept this award on his behalf. Garrett and Phil were such great friends. And he was a soul friend of Garrett's and a soul friend of ours, so I would invite the Sheehan family to come up and accept the award. Oh, they're not here. I apologize. Guess the snow kept them away. But the other person whom Garrett nominated during his last round of nominees was Mickey Ward. As many of you know, Irish Mickey Ward is a native Lowellian and a professional boxer who competed from 1985 through 2003. Mickey's great-grandparents fled Ireland, settling in Lowell to work as laborers in the mills. And our own Tom Malone, who is here, just told me before I stepped up here, Mickey, that he did some ancestry work on your family, so he did prove that you are, in fact, from the Emerald Isle. So if you need any information about your own family, feel free to reach out to Tom Malone. As a boxer, Mickey trained locally at the West End Gym. He won the Golden Gloves 3 times before turning professional in 1985. Mickey held the light welterweight title in 2000 and is widely known, as we all probably remember such good times, for his trilogy of fights with a friendly rival, Arturo Gatti. Mickey always represented Lowell and his Irish roots at his fights. He proudly wore, as many of us remember, the Lowell Spitters jersey when he went into the ring, and always used that nickname, Irish Mickey Ward, for his introductions. He won a fight against Gatti, a 9th-round lockdown, and a majority decision. Ring Magazine named that event Fight of the Year. A rematch was held in November of 2002, with Gatti winning the 3rd round. The two fighters agreed to a 3rd match in 2003. And although Gatti won, Ring Magazine named that match Fight of the Year for 2003 due to the tenacity of both of the athletes, resulting in the 3rd straight Fight of the Year honor for Mickey Ward. The last athlete to achieve such an honor, there were two of them, Rocky Marciano and Carmen Basilio, in the 1950s. Now, many of us also remember that there was some commotion in Lowell because actor Mark Wahlberg came here and he portrayed Mickey in the 2010 film The Fighter, which was based on Mickey's career. Now, Colleen, Hannah, and I have been talking. We really hope that number 2 is coming, so we hope that there's going to be a sequel soon. If you want to share some secrets before you leave tonight, Mickey, there are several of us that are very interested. In 2005, Mickey started the nonprofit charitable organization Team Mickey Ward Charities to provide financial assistance to children and families in need to help them improve their everyday quality of life. Although Mickey has done amazing things as an athlete, what really makes him our soul friend is the charity work that he has done. He's raised thousands of dollars for worthy causes. He has organized numerous events such as golf tournaments and bike runs to raise finances for those in need, regardless of race, religion, age, or ethnicity. Mickey has also donated his time on countless occasions to speak to school-aged children, encouraging them to work hard and not give up on their dreams. He is a supporter of Catholic education. For many years, I would go to my kids' auction events, and there would always be some sort of signed memorabilia from Mickey Ward. And he very quietly donated everything, never wanting the attention for it. A successful athlete who never forgot his roots. He always remembers to give back to his community in Lowell. Mickey Ward is a very, very worthy recipient of the Anam Cara honors. So would you please come up to accept your award, Mickey? Tonight we'd also like to make mention of our Irish Person of the Year, and like the last two Anam Cara honorees, Father Charles McGrill was the last nomination that Garrett Sheehan made for Irish Person of the Year. The ICC is grateful for this opportunity to posthumously recognize the Reverend Charles McGrill as Irish Person of the Year for 2022. And we would like to thank Mr. and Mrs. Tom Linehan for being here. Would you wave to us? Cousins of Charles McGrill, who were happy to be here to represent him. Father McGrill was raised in Lowell. He attended St. Michael's Grammar School. He graduated from Lowell High School, and then he went on to earn a bachelor's degree from Pius X School of Liturgical Music at Manhattanville College in Purchase, New York. He then earned a master's degree in religious studies from Emmanuel College in Boston. Prior to joining the priesthood, Father McGrill served as the organist and choir director at St. Patrick's Church. He was known to play the organ at St. Patrick's with grandeur and finesse. During the recent renovation of the organ at St. Patrick's, he checked in very frequently on the progress, and he would remind Dave McKeon from the committee of some of the keys that used to stick a bit, and wanted to make sure that we were correcting those during the renovation process. We are quite sure that Father McGrill looks down upon the beautifully restored grand organ at St. Patrick's with joy and pride every Sunday when it's played. Father McGrill also served as an organist at a parish in Roslindale prior to attending the seminary. He later attended Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio, and was ordained a priest for the service in the Diocese of Norwich on December 6th of 1980. He served as parochial vicar in parishes in Connecticut, and in 1989 he was appointed as pastor of St. Patrick Church in Mystic, Connecticut. He frequently referred to Mystic as Sunny Mystic. And I imagine there's a joke to that I haven't heard yet, so if anyone knows about the joke about Sunny Mystic, please let me know. He was a member of the Norwich Diocesan College of Consultors, the Presbyterial Council, and the Liturgical Commission. He retired from active ministry as pastor of St. Patrick's in Mystic, and he passed away on Friday, May 28th, 2021. For his lifetime service, the Irish Culture Committee is proud to posthumously honor Reverend Charles McGrill as Irish Person of the Year, and we wish that his legacy of service sets an example for generations to come. Tom Linehan would like to speak on behalf of Father. Great.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to, in behalf of Father McGrail, I would like to thank the committee for this nomination. It was very nice, and I'm sure that he would be very, very pleased to receive it. So we visited with him, my wife and I, a few times down in Connecticut, and he always asked about St. Patrick's, always asked about the parish, the church, the school, and how things were going, and particularly about his organ. So, on his behalf, I appreciate this, and I thank you.
The next portion of our evening is the Acre Forum, and we are very excited to introduce Brian C. Mitchell. Brian is the author of a book called The Patty Camps, which is about Lowell. Many of you have probably read it. I told him tonight, I received this copy of a book. It was a book from a student at UMass Lowell in the Irish Studies Department. His mom was my daughter's Irish step teacher, and they were working on some various choreography dances, and many of them were based on Irish traditions that came right out of Ireland. And she gave me this book. She told me I needed to read it because I was a Lowellian, and she said someday we need to create a dance or choreograph a dance based upon this book. So it hasn't happened yet, but we're really hoping that it will. Mr. Mitchell has an amazingly impressive resume. He was the president of Bucknell College. He was the president of Washington and Jefferson College. He established and worked on an amazing number of organizations for higher education. He is a graduate of St. Margaret's School right in this neighborhood, and he attended Keith Academy. He thereafter graduated from Merrimack College and served on the Board of Trustees for many years. He is associated with an amazing number of higher educational institutions and is a well-published author. But by training, Dr. Mitchell is an immigration and labor historian. The acclaimed book, The Patty Camps, that I just held up for you, is about the Irish of Lowell between 1821 and 1861. And as many of you know, the Patty Camps is the area right where St. Patrick's Church is. So he's going to tell us about that, and he will be much more interesting than I am to tell you about that. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Mr. Brian Mitchell.
Thank you. It is on, okay. First, thanks to Kim for the very generous introduction. I'm reminded when somebody begins to read the resume that I'm getting really, really old. Having said that, I also want to say that I'm very proud to be from Lowell. My father taught high school history, and some of you may have had Chris Mitchell at Lowell High. My mother was the secretary in the police department. My sister was the vice principal at the Lincoln. My other sister taught at the Franco-American. Let's see, Aunt Margaret was at I forget what school. Aunt Julia was the assistant city clerk, and Uncle Leo was the head of the tourist officers in Lowell. We represented at least $1 on your tax rate sometime in the 1960s. And I want to thank you for making it possible, because I doubt I would have gotten through college if you hadn't been so gracious. So thank you for the scholarship. Much appreciated. Look, I want to talk a little bit about the very earliest years in Lowell.
The mic closer to your mouth, please.
Can't hear.
You can't, there we go, it is on now, okay. Well, let's go back for the next 2.5 hours and review my resume. What I'd like to do is I'd like to focus tonight on the Irish in Lowell. My wife's family are the Hafeys, who some of you may have known James Hafey, who remained in the Acre, but my father-in-law and mother-in-law were married in St. Patrick's. And it's an area that is significantly interesting for a number of reasons. So to start, I want to make sure that I thank everyone. I'm going to get that out of the way first. That includes the Irish Cultural Committee, the Lowell National Historical Park, the Charles River Museum, and the Middlesex Canal Museum. I also want to offer a special word of thanks to Ray Levitt, who guided me through the process of getting between Washington and Lowell in what was an incredibly bumpy flight on JetBlue this morning. As the press suggests, this marks the 200th anniversary of the first Irish settlers in Lowell. So we're going to focus on the first 20 years or so. And let's start with the obvious question. Why Lowell? I mean, why Irish? Why Lowell? Why then? And the answers are fairly complex. And we're going to start, I think, a little bit in Ireland. Ireland in the early part of the 19th century was a tough place that was heading towards catastrophe. It was an area that was significantly, that was largely agricultural, and that families could thrive on if they continued to simply, what was called partible inheritance, if they could consistently split up the land in such a way that the potato would allow them, as early as the 1820s certainly, the potato would allow them to continue to live on the land and pay the tenants' fees that were necessary. Now all of that would come down in a crashing catastrophe from 1845 to about 1852. But having said that, it was highly dependent on agriculture and increasingly dependent upon the potato, but it wasn't the reason that the Irish settled in Lowell. It's the reason that the Irish overwhelmed the facilities that made the community of the Acre become a different kind of place by 1860, but it wasn't the reason for the settlement. The reason was very simple. There was already an established Irish community in Charlestown and in Boston, as well as scattered throughout in other towns. Many of the Irish had walked by foot or come down by packet and mail steamer from Halifax or from areas where they would normally come as part of the British Empire. And they would come to places like Charlestown, which was, for most of us, remembered largely because it was the place where the revolution arguably started, but in fact was by then a fairly thriving port. As Boston was beginning to fill out its docks and Charlestown was beginning to expand, there were jobs for unskilled, although not exclusively unskilled, but unskilled laborers. So the point is, there was already a community in place. But again, why Lowell? Well, Lowell was connected to Boston in ways that the Middlesex Canal Association can speak to, I think, with considerable basis in fact. The fact is that if you look at the Middlesex Canal and the Blackstone Canal, these were the big digs of the 19th century. They were hugely significant. They were major projects, not only for Boston, but they were national models of how to begin, before railroads, of how to begin to connect point A to point B. So when we argue, as historically we did, and I certainly did in paddy camps, when we begin to argue that in fact Lowell started because it was a 32, if I recall, foot drop in the river at Lowell, that was certainly one of the reasons, but it wasn't the only reason. And it wasn't the reason necessarily that the Irish found it so easy to come up to Lowell. The fact was, if the Middlesex Canal had not been built, if the transportation had not connected and paved the way for the right-of-ways that would build the Boston and Lowell Railroad, then in fact there may not have been an Irish settlement in Lowell because the investors might not have invested in Lowell because labor had to meet the demands of capital, and the capital had already been invested in the Middlesex Canal. So when you put that together, you begin to understand that there's a much larger force going on as America begins to industrialize. There was therefore a tradition of large-scale public works projects in the United States, this kind of big dig for the 21st century, for the early 19th century, and the Irish were available. They were largely the unskilled labor force because the rest of the force in New England had been tapped out. Well, what do I mean by that? Fisheries, timber, slave trade, rum trade, anything that in fact in the beginning of the whaling season in decades as well in New England. So as a result, in the southern and central parts of New England, most of the unskilled or semi-skilled labor force was already beginning to move in other directions. In northern New England, the farming situation was pretty dire. It's terrible land to farm, and there was rich land to the west. Now, by that I mean not to Illinois or Wisconsin, I mean to upstate New York. Rochester, New York, for example, I'm a PhD from the University of Rochester. Rochester, New York was first called the Flour City because it supplied much of the wheat and milled most of the flour that in fact was used in the Northeast as it began to industrialize. So the northern farmers could begin to move west. The rest of the unskilled and semi-skilled labor force could move into other trades. And one of the reasons that the Irish found the opportunity in Lowell is because they were arguably the only choice because they had one skill. They had already worked some on the docks in Boston, and in addition to that, they had worked in large-scale public works projects like the Blackstone Canal and the Middlesex Canal coming up from Charlestown to Lowell. So when, in fact, the Boston investors made a decision, and an important decision, that they would begin to look at Lancashire in England, and they said to themselves, we could translate thread into at least cheap cotton calico cloth and begin to see whether we could make an investment based on the experiment not only occurring in Pawtucket, but also in Waltham, and translate it into a significant investment in Lowell. They already had a lot of the infrastructure in place, particularly the canal. And what that meant, I'm trying to tie all four groups that are supporting all this together. And what that meant, therefore, was that it wasn't a given that, in fact, they would succeed. But on the other hand, it wasn't necessarily something that they did that was as innovative as you might think. It was a careful, calculated, carefully designed effort to invest capital and to find the labor necessary to make the investment pay off. That's where the Irish came in. The Irish had some experience, as I've said, and it was necessary because they knew what they were doing in terms of doing what was most important, which wasn't digging the mills at first, but building the power canals. And when you build the power canals, you're really building a variation, not the same thing obviously, but a variation of what they had already done. And what that meant was it was a fairly prudent, conservative investment in terms of which labor force they turned to. Now, you get to Lowell and you say to yourself, well, that's good, you're Kirk Boot, or you're one of the overseers or investors in Lowell. And you say to yourself, well, that's good, we've got a ready labor force, but we also have to populate the mills. The only other really logical available labor force that existed, particularly since you're being influenced by the paternalism of some of the utopian communities in England, that was the farm girls of central and northern New England. So you have this folks, you have this interesting juxtaposition. You've got the farm girls from central and northern New England in this rural, pastoral community that is benevolent by nature and expensive to run and maintain with its boarding houses and cultural associations and athenaeums and the whole community that was necessary to support the morality of the 19th century for women. And you've got a bunch of Irish work gangs 3 blocks away. You've got a problem then, because you've got to figure out how to handle that. And not only that, but the Irish work gangs 3 blocks away weren't one gang. They were, in those days, divided by ancestry, not so much by religion, but by ancestry. So, for example, one group was the Corkonians, and they lived in a certain paddy camp, and the paddy camps were adjacent to each other, and yes, there were the usual expectations in terms of they weren't necessarily in church all the time, and it was a male-dominated society, and it was a bunch of folks who were behaving in much the same way that when, for example, in the 19th century later, the American West was built and the railroads were created, these towns were often built and organized in the same kind of fashion. So, you're an overseer in Lowell. 3 blocks from each other, you've got the paddy camps, and you've got the mill girls who have to be in at a certain time and have folks who are maintaining the propriety and the dignity of the boarding houses, and they work very hard, and they're encouraged to be paid well, and it is all working out so well from that perspective, and you've got the Irish, but you'd expect they'd go away. But here's the problem. Lowell was too successful. Now, you had to be careful about this because the War of 1812 had just happened. There were a series of many insignificant recessions that went through, and so you're an investor and you're saying, well, don't worry about it. What we'll do is we'll build the name your mill, name your power canal. We'll see how that goes and we'll take it from there. But the thirst for cotton cloth, particularly in the American South, and the ability of the shipping trades to carry all that through meant that Lowell was more successful than I suspect they dreamed it ever would be. Not only that, but the Lowell experiment became the Lowell Plan. And the Lowell Plan is, well, what Chicopee and Holyoke. And when steam came in, to some extent, Fall River, New Bedford, certainly Lawrence and Manchester, they're all built according to the Lowell Plan. So that Lowell becomes a place from which laborers could centralize themselves and still do work upriver in Lawrence. It could become a place where work was almost guaranteed from 1822 until the mills began to mature in the late 1830s and early 1840s. So now you have a problem. And the problem that you have essentially is that you've got to find some way to create a sense of community. How do you do that? Well, what you do is you allow the Irish to self-govern themselves. So you set up and you support and you actively encourage people like Hugh Comiskey and his benevolent associations, and you encourage a merchant trade, and you encourage the kinds of things that translate the paddy camps into the Acre. How do you do it? What's the principal organization that you put into place? The answer is the Catholic Church. Now, I'm Catholic, so I can speak at some length on this. It's the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was run by a series of bishops who were pretty well respected, Fenwick and others, who were pretty well respected in Boston. And they're trying to establish in Irish communities that are beginning to grow up in areas that are surrounding Boston, parishes, or at least parishes to which priests could ride in and occasionally say Mass. If you're a Yankee overseer, you're looking at the church, and it may not be your kind of church, but at least it's a way of beginning to establish a kind of urban identity for a neighborhood, because it's translated and morphed from paddy camps to the Acre. And it needs a series of regulators, if you will, because something else has happened. As work continued, and as the workers began to see the fact that there was almost unlimited employment as unskilled and semi-skilled labor in Lowell, and as they began to develop trade potential so that work on for the Locks and Canals Company could translate to the Lowell Machine Shop and to other kinds of places, it became clear that they would take their families or start families or bring families with them. Now, this is all pre-famine immigration. And so you begin to see not only the emergence of a community, but a community that is now nuclear family-centered, and often matriarchal in nature, which supports the church as well. What does that mean for the Irish in Lowell? For the Irish in Lowell, it means that you're beginning to expand. The Acre neighborhood is itself growing, and it's now beginning to move out and abut places like the Lowell Machine Shop, the Lowell Manufacturing Company, the Hamilton Mills, the Appleton Mills. It's coming very close to it. So what we're beginning to see is that as the Acre grows, so too does Lowell. But what's happening is the community that was Yankee Mill Girls is centralized on those boarding houses, while the rest of the world is growing up around it, in some respects dominated by the Irish. You've also got another problem. By the by the middle 1830s or so, we're beginning to see the first signs of agitation among the Yankee mill women. Now, if that's the case, you've got the perfect solution in 1822 that's not necessarily applying at the same level as 1835 or 1840. Because you've got the Yankee mill women beginning to withdraw from the mills, the tenures are beginning to shorten some, and agitation is beginning to increase. So what do? And again, I mentioned my dad taught high school history at Lowell High, so I'll mention Lowell High here. You set up the first co-educational high school in the country. Why? To educate the daughters of Irish laborers, the matriarchal class that was in fact in the Acre. Why? Because you needed to teach them the industrial work rhythm. The mills operated from X to Y, 6 days a week. And the only way you could do that is you had to make certain that there were expectations and standards in place that reflected the fact that Lowell was moving from a mill village to an immigrant industrial city. That city was also beginning to expand. About the time, in fact, that the Great Famine began to come and overwhelm the facilities, healthcare, cultural, social facilities in Lowell, from 1845 to about 1853, Lowell also began to expand. St. Mary's Parish was set up, no longer there. And St. Peter's Parish, also surprisingly no longer there as well. But it began to envelop and surround the old Yankee district. Now at the same time, there was a Yankee middle class that was beginning to climb up and live on the hills that surrounded Lowell. The Highlands and Belvedere and Centerville and other places as well. But for the most part, the city by 1850 looked very different than the city of 1822. And there were two dramatic shifts. The first dramatic shift was the fact that the Acre became its own community, spearheaded by a conservative group of benevolent associations and by the Catholic Church, and organized around principles that in fact were acknowledged and institutionalized by places like Lowell High School. What did that mean? By 1850, as thousands of famine immigrants swept into cities like Boston and Lowell, which was one of the 30 or 40 largest cities in the United States at the time, there began to be a natural nativist reaction, the know-nothing attacks on the convent, the Notre Dame convent next to St. Patrick's Church, being a good example. Because it all seems so different. It's not what Lowell was supposed to be, but it is what Lowell became. And as Lowell began to adopt the Irish community and to bring it into the textile mills and into the machine shops and into maintaining the power canals and into whatever and wherever else the Irish could begin to see themselves going, the Civil War suddenly broke out. And in 1862, if I remember correctly, the Civil War shut down the mills. Now when that happened, the mills reopened, but they reopened to a large next wave of immigrants, French Canadians, coming down, walking or by train from French Canada, and followed by Poles and Portuguese and Greeks and other communities as well. By 1910, Lowell was one of the 5 most intensely immigrant cities in the United States. Lawrence, incidentally, was one of the other 5 among major cities in 1910 census data. And what that meant, and the point of the story tonight, is that the Acre should be seen as the beginning, a starting point, if you would, of a much larger evolution in terms of the history of immigration in this city. And as you look at the Acre today, you see other immigrant groups coming into the city as well. And in a sense, that should be expected, because Lowell has been one of those places that always accommodated, sometimes not as well as it should, sometimes better than you'd expect, other immigrant groups as well. And what that means essentially for Lowell is that you're beginning to see the same kind, through a 200-year history, the same kind of immigration that in fact, for different reasons and different groups, that in fact you began to see in terms of what brought the early immigrants to Lowell as well. So let me just conclude by saying this. If you look at the early history, what we're celebrating tonight, the 200-year history of Lowell, and the Irish specifically in Lowell, what you're seeing is a synonymous growth of the city, and at the same time, the immigrant groups that began, specifically the Irish, that began to create, if you will, what we know today and what we all love as a city. What that meant is that there had to be intersection on a broader level of things like capital and labor. Power was a given, transportation was a given, but the Irish came because there was a need for them. The Irish began to assimilate, and as they assimilated, they adopted a pattern in an immigrant industrial city that was reflected much more broadly in terms of the continuing history over the past 200 years. So having said all that, let's open it up for questions now. Any question you want?
Dr. Mitchell?
Hmm?
What prompted you to write the book, That Yes?
I was going to write a book on Samuel Eliot Morison. And Samuel Eliot Morison is the famous World War II historian, Admiral Morison. His grandfather, Charles Eliot, was the president of Harvard. T.S. Eliot, the poet, was his cousin. And Harrison Gray Otis, the guy who tried to take New England out of the War of 1812, was his other grandfather. And so I went and I borrowed a trench coat from my brother. Billy Nichols would know Gene Fennelly, from my brother-in-law. And I cut my hair short enough so you couldn't still see my ears, but it was as short as I'd ever had it. And I borrowed a tie from my dad, and I went to Samuel Eliot Morison's house, number 44 Brimmer Street on Beacon Hill. And I was ushered into the second floor by a Swiss maid, because he later explained to me the Swiss from Geneva speak the best French. Now, if you're a kid from Keith, you're hoping you get a gentleman's C and just sort of quietly drop the subject. But that was fine. I could barely understand myself. And I was going to write a book on Samuel Eliot Morison, but his papers were set in place for 75 years. They're still not open. So I went back to the University of Rochester, and I was studying in a guy named Eugene Genovese, who was the head of the Organization of American Historians. And he made a joke that sort of stuck with me. He said that Mr. Mitchell, to the graduate class, he said, Mr. Mitchell has done something that few of his kind have ever been able to do. He said he is, to my knowledge, the first Irishman ever allowed in the front door of number 44 Burma Street. When he said Irish, it dawned on me that I had always been interested. My dad was a high school history teacher, and I would read comic books, and I read my father's history books. And it just seemed to me that as Lowell was beginning to think about the Lowell National Historical Park, it just dawned on me that this was something I really wanted to write about. And so it was clear that to write well about it, you had to look at what you were interested in. Immigration interested me, and if you're going to write about immigration, you start where it all began, and that's with the Acre. Other questions? Good question. Yes, ma'am.
Who was responsible for burning down the buildings in Patrick's Church?
I'm sorry, who were responsible?
Burning down the original St. Patrick's Church.
You know, I should know, but I don't. I'm going to see the restoration tomorrow morning, so I'm going to be really interested to see that. There may be somebody like Ray Levitt who might know that, or Dave McKeon. So I think you should keep it there. It's a good question. If you find out, let me know too. Yeah. You want to speak to that?
The church wasn't burned down, it was taken down, 1845.
That's right, that's right.
There was a fire in 1901.
Did you refer to the 1901 fire? Is that what you're talking about?
The original wooden church were in St. Patrick's.
The 1901, so... Well, the original church was taken down, that part is right. It was the 1901 church was not wood, though, if I recall correctly. So I think we're maybe conflating the two. The wood was taken down and the fire occurred in a stone church. Okay, other questions? Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Brian, can you tell us why St. Patrick's is where it is?
I can tell you that as near as I could tell in the records, it was partly because they were offered the land. And so as a result, you know, you're offered land free or cheap and you take it, and so that's why they did. They also tried to place it in such a way, this is somewhat verified by the research I've done, but I never could find two sources on it. They wanted to place it between and among the camps so that it sort of separated out. It was sort of the sort of central point where the various camps would be able to look to the church rather than look to where they would duke it out. Yes, yes, ma'am.
Lowell High School was the first high school in the entire United States that allowed women. You know what brought that about? I always wonder what brought it about.
Well, you know, I tried to make the point that I think what brought it about was the fact that Lowell High was set up and approved of by the mill owners who still ran the place when Lowell High was organized. Was it 1836, if I recall? And if I recall that date correctly, that would certainly be when those mill owners wanted to begin to retrain particularly immigrant daughters from the Acre. So as a result, they allowed women in because those women were about to go into the factories. And when they went into the factories, they wanted them to understand what the rules were. And the rules were taught by Lowell High School, what we call the industrial work rhythm. You know, there were certain principles and values, a certain amount of training that had to be done. They had to understand how to read and write, how to do certain things that were necessary to survive the environment that was becoming increasingly technical. Oh, sure, good question. That might be my favorite question, actually. There you go. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Would that be the same reason Lowell High also became one of the first desegregated high schools in the country, the state?
I think it could be. Lowell was a deeply immigrant town, and so when you say desegregated, it depends on desegregated for whom. So if you mean desegregated by race, you know, the racial situations are very different in the North than they are in the South. I remember being shocked in 1975 when I went out to see Fort Sumter, and there were two ferries, one for blacks and one for whites. You wouldn't see that in Boston or Lowell, but you'd see a different kind of segregation. The other thing is that Lowell was overwhelmingly Caucasian at the point at which it desegregated, so it wasn't as big a deal. It's not as though 50% of the population was African American. You know, I think when I was a kid growing up, I think it was 96%, maybe heavily immigrant, but 96% Caucasian.
And could you talk about those who haven't read the book, talk a little bit more about the conditions in the Patty camp?
Sure. Sure. The original work camps were just that. They were work camps. And so you should not assume that they were anything other than nail camps the way you would along a railroad line being built in the American West. What surprised me is that as early as the very early 1830s, a street plan had begun to be laid out. And so as a result, it's at that point you can begin to see the metamorphosis. That's about the same time the church is established. You can begin to see the metamorphosis of the acre, and you would see wood frame construction, although not exclusively, but you'd see wood frame construction, and you would see more substantial houses, and you'd also see the beginnings of a small but sort of persistent Irish merchant class, people who did dry goods and other kinds of things. You know, what would you call them today? Almost like mini department stores or Highland Variety, I guess, where I grew up in the Highlands. Those kinds of things would begin to develop as well. And I'd say but certainly by the time that Notre Dame Academy and St. Patrick's Parish and some of the other Catholic buildings had been set up by the time of the Know-Nothing attacks in the 1840s, there was more use of brick, and it was more substantial and began to look like many cities in the, you couldn't quite say industrial Northeast because Lowell was really the best example of the industrial Northeast, but it began to look more like any other city that was growing into an industrial center. So not particularly pretty, but there were moments, for example, the church. You think of how beautiful, one of the things that always strikes people when they come to Lowell is the beauty of the churches. You know, each one looks like a cathedral. Well, not everyone, but many of them look like cathedrals. And that is not necessarily what you see in other parts of the country, but it is what you see often in the industrial Northeast. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You talked about the Middlesex Canal. Could you elaborate more on that, like point A to point B?
Well, I mean, it starts...
all Irish that built that?
Well, again, the point was to be able to draw goods and to connect it to the river. In many respects, before power canals, Pennsylvania is a really good example of this. Before railroads, rather, were built, you had to find a way to begin to translate the production of goods that could be brought either to or from Western environments. And by Western environments, that would be central Massachusetts or into southern New Hampshire or something like that. So what you did is you tried to tap the rivers. In this case, the ability to tap into the river, to tap into Boston Harbor, and to have a 32-foot drop in the falls, you can begin to see why they'd invest here. It just made a great deal of sense. So the Middlesex Canal, you can argue whether it was hugely successful or not successful at all. But then that's true of almost all power canals. I lived in Rochester, which was on the Erie Canal, and they had those same debates in upstate New York as well. But they were meant to be ways to connect the country together. And as much, think of Eisenhower and the interstate highway system in the 1950s. Same kind of principle. Other questions?
Dr. Mitchell, could you share a story about Keith Academy or the Zavarian brothers?
Yikes. Let's see, what could I say? I was pretty good in humanities and in English and history, and I was terrible in math. And I think he's still alive. He's at St. John's up in Shrewsbury. If you didn't get, I remember even the text was called the Dulciani text. If you didn't get the answer correct in algebra, he would walk up behind you and he would smash you with both hands and the Dulciani text on the top of the head. And so I spent far more time trying to learn algebra than anything else at Keith Academy because it really hurt, and I got hit a lot. Any other questions? Well, yes, sir.
And Brian, any thoughts on why Lowell has been so successful with all these different immigrant groups over the years, and today with the Cambodian population we have? Any thoughts as to what some keys are for that success?
Yeah, I think there was brilliant, I can't say I was a part of it because I was a little too young in those days, but I think there was really creative leadership in the 1970s here, and later, certainly. Lowell was a place, for my generation in the 70s, and I graduated the last year Keith closed in 1970. In 1970, I mean, I was basically, the choices for me, you could become a lawyer. My mother said a novena every night, so she expected me to be the family priest. And since I met my wife at 16, that wasn't going to work out all that well for me. So that wasn't going to be something that was going to. Or you could go into what was then the beginnings of a electronics belt around 128. Then became a high-tech belt. 495 was built, and so on. And I think a lot of people thought Lowell was a place that you escaped from. And what they did is they used the Lowell State Interpretive Parks, Heritage Parks, and they used the Lowell National Historic Park, Pat Mogan and others, to really redefine one's sense of self. And so, if somebody asked me, I mean, I lived away from Lowell for more than half my life, 30 years away from New England until last September in downtown Boston or Hingham, and now in Washington, D.C. But I always say I'm from Lowell. I never, even though I'm a New England guy, I never say I'm from Boston. And when you live far away, you always say you're from Boston. You never say you're from Lowell. And I think it did something. There's a sense of self, something in the mind that is created that makes Lowell sort of unique, idiosyncratic, and special. And I don't think if they had not redefined Lowell as Lowell, if they had not redefined Lowell as through its history, its culture, and its traditions, I don't think half of you would be here tonight. And I think that's the genius of Lowell. They went at a point at which the city had dropped to about 80, I think you're about 115 or 16,000 people today, at a point at which it had dropped to about 85,000 and was beginning to sort of sink into obscurity. And the mills, you take the mills down, you create a miracle mile, would you really put a technological belt in what is now largely UMass property, and so on. You had decisions to make, and instead of bulldozing the West End like they did in Boston or doing other kinds of things that they think would work, I think Lowell focused more in the mind. It focused more in the heart, and it focused more in the culture and traditions, and I think that's what saved Lowell. So in terms of why more groups assimilate more easily, I think they work at it harder here. And I think you had good people. Paul Sarkis, I think, was pretty good in this regard. I think you had good people here. I should say we, since I'm from here. We had good people here for a lot of years. We also had tremendous political pull in Washington. Tip O'Neill, the Kennedy family, particularly Ted Kennedy, and that helped too, because you could bring and you could marry, if you will, some of the money that was necessary to make the changes with the cultural and the social and the political changes that were also necessary, that allowed you the freedom and the luxury to think a little bit about how you wanted to assimilate and accommodate and integrate. Other questions? Well, again, I'll end by saying congratulations on the 200th anniversary. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come back to Lowell. I appreciate for the first time in decades, even with COVID, I didn't have to try to pronounce ah.
What an amazing evening. So we have a native Lowell son who's an historian, has honored his Irish heritage by authoring a book and coming back all these years later to share stories with us. We have an amazing athlete who always continued to honor his Irish heritage and really always remembers to give back to the community in which he was raised. We have a young professional who is serving our community in an amazing way at our cemeteries, which will really honor our ancestors, ourselves, for generations to come. And although Phil wasn't here, we were able to honor a public servant who, for so many decades, has done so many things for our city and for the Acre neighborhood. There is one person we attempted to honor tonight, and she humbly did not accept the honor. One of the sisters in Lowell, we tried to honor, and she asked that we not observe the honor in her name, which is not always surprising, but we did want to mention it to you because to our committee, St. Patrick's School and Catholic education is still a very, very important priority. So the committee has made a donation to St. Patrick's, and we will continue to honor St. Patrick's School and Catholic education, and we ask that you keep St. Patrick's School and Catholic education on your minds and in your hearts. We also have a native son who is an amazing musician who always entertains us every year for Irish Cultural Week. So thank you again to Chuck Campbell. Chuck's going to be here for a little while. We're going to hear some more great traditional Irish music. A few things before we end. We have some books for sale. Our committee historian Dave McKeon has authored yet another book, Lowell Irish 200. It is for sale over here. $20 a piece, and all the profits will benefit St. Patrick's School. A couple of other books are for sale too, and I always mess the names up. Is it Those That Went Before Us? Something like that, which is going for $10. And there is a book about the Irish Catholic Genesis of Lowell or something like that, and that's for sale for $5. Again, all of the profits of the books will benefit St. Patrick's School. We also have many more events that are coming up. For Irish Cultural Week, on Saturday morning, someone's waving to me. Oh, okay. Saturday morning we have the cemetery walk. Saturday evening at Lindsay's we have the dinner dance. On Sunday, the Ladies Ancient Order of Hibernians and the Ancient Order of Hibernians is hosting a Kaylee at Longmeadow Golf Club. On April 6th, we are going to commemorate the 200th anniversary of Hugh Comiskey's walk from Charlestown up to Lowell. We're going to meet at the statue, the worker statue, which is at the corner of Market and Shattuck Street. We're going to lay a wreath there and have a few words, and then we're going to go to the Old Worthen. Now, Hugh Comiskey did not go to the Old Worthen. He went to the Fry Tavern, and I can't remember where that is. Dave probably can tell you. Where is it? It was on Central Street. He went to the Fry Tavern when he walked up with his 30 guys, and he had a pint or 12 with Kirk Booth. And we think that the Worthen is probably the closest type of tavern to what that would have been like, so we're going to convene there to make sure we honor our heritage, both Irish heritage and our local heritage, on April 6th. All of the information about these events is available on Lowell Irish on Facebook, also on our website, which has a very long domain, so if you go to Lowell Irish on Facebook, it's probably the easiest way to find it. Also, there have been some posters around. We have been partnering with the National Park Service. There are some amazing programs about the canal diggers that will be coming up. We've got several events planned for the rest of the year, so please come back and join us. It means so much to us, particularly after these 2 years of the pandemic, to see all of your faces here. We really appreciate it. We love celebrating our Irish heritage. We love celebrating our Acre heritage, our Lowell heritage, and we couldn't do it if we didn't have people joining us. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all of our honorees, and please come back again and celebrate with us.
Did something